Okay, so we can perceive a gamut of colors. So we can see not only these sort of pure blues, pure greens, and pure reds, but also a lot of these colors in between. And for those of you that start working with color or get interested in color management and start talking and start working with this, you might start to recognize this particular type of graph. And so in this graph, this is just a representation of something called a color space, which all it is saying is just a representation of available colors. So in this color space, for example, this is representing all of the colors that we can see with our eyes. So we can see all the way from this very deep blue, which is at about this wavelength of 380 nanometers. We just go all the way around. So this very outside edge of this color space represents the individual colors that we can see with our eyes. And so there's an important thing that I have to mention here that this outside line represents, and that is that these colors are, if you were to imagine some source of light that was only capable of producing that one frequency of light. So let's say a red laser, for example, is able to produce something along somewhere around here. So most of the light that we see, such as coming from our computer screens or from the lights or even from the sun in the sky, doesn't produce monochromatic color. It's not one color that it produces. It produces usually a range of colors, and it is that we see normally in day-to-day life. But if we want to produce individual colors, that is sort of the most saturated version of these colors that you can imagine. So it's not the same thing to look at this on this projector, because I'm sure that even in your mind you can imagine that this blue, for example, you can imagine a blue that's much more saturated, or this green at the far upper left-hand corner that's much more green. It just looks much more saturated. And this isn't, this is supposed to represent that. This isn't saying, okay, this is, you just have to imagine that all of the brightest of the bright colors that you can see is along that outside edge. And that's all that this is really trying to represent. Now we can start to combine those. So if you imagine that we have this very, very, it doesn't even have to be bright. I'm just talking about very strong in color, very saturated red laser, for example. Nothing that's very bright, something like this. Then you have another one, maybe a blue laser, for example, and it's over here. You combine the two. So you point the two at the same point, and it combines the light to be this purplish light. You can actually draw a line between those 2 points and the one right in the middle. That's that color that will be represented. So what we're showing here is this capability of mixing various colors to get all of the colors that we can perceive, just, period. Everything that we can see and perceive is supposed to be represented by this graph. Now you might be wondering why it's shown like this, why there's an x-axis, why there's a y-axis. Just very briefly for your interest, I don't think it's very important, but they put along the x-axis something called chromaticity, and then they put along the y-axis the luminance, so how bright something will appear. So from that respect, this might make a little bit more sense, and this is certainly what we have talked about. Blue will be the least luminant, red will be next, and then at the very top will be green. Okay, so we can represent white, for example, by mixing all of these colors together, and at the very center we will get sort of this white light that we can imagine. Okay, so just remember that along the outside is this monochromatic light, something that is produced, that is capable of producing that wavelength and only that wavelength, and that is what we are taking a look at. Now, because we are looking at, say, a computer screen, or because we are looking at a projector, either of these devices are not capable of producing the entire color range that's available to us for viewing. So it's going to be some smaller subset within this that a computer or a projector will be able to display to us. And so you can imagine that in order for a computer display to work, so as you know, or as you might know, most computer displays work by having very, very small dots. So especially the LCDs that we have now, they have very small pixels on them, a red pixel, a green pixel, and a blue pixel. And then it's the combination of these pixels that will produce all of the colors that we are able to see on the computer screen. Now these screens, though, aren't perfect. They're not able to make a perfectly monochromatic color. It's usually something a little bit inside. And even though we have a red pixel over here, a blue pixel over here, and a green pixel over here, it's going to be much smaller than that. So we can imagine that we're going to have this triangle in here of sorts that represents all of the colors that are possible. And a lot of the color spaces even that we talk about over time work in the same way. So there's a few color spaces that we've at least alluded to in the past, and one of them is RGB or sRGB, and this is sort of the default, the de facto color space that you will be using when you are publishing your photos on the web or when you will be displaying them on a computer screen. Basically, anything that is not going to go to print, you will use sRGB. That is because this is very, very common, and it's supported by pretty much all digital cameras. It's supported by pretty much all computers. It's supported by pretty much all devices. So this is the way to go when you want to display accurate color on a computer screen or on a projector, for example. And so it defines in the sRGB space these maximums. So there will be this maximum blue over here. There'll be this maximum red over here. There's this maximum green over here. And the center of which is this white. And they just called this white D65. I don't know why it's called that. It seems pretty arbitrary to me. But just realize that it's called this, D65, that represents that exact amount of white. So there's not this sort of color cast to it. It's not a yellowish white. It's not a reddish white. It's not a greenish white. It's just white. That is what they're calling white. Okay. Now, to make this a little bit more tangible, imagine what you've learned up until this point in terms of pixels in, say, a JPEG file. So a JPEG file, as you know, is for one pixel is made up of a red component, green component, and a blue component with numbers ranging from 0 to 255 for each, right? But how does the computer know what each of those values mean? Like, how does it know when you say 255 for red, 0 for green, 0 for blue? How does it know which of these reds that value means? That is what this color space is trying to solve. It's saying very definitively that a value of 255 for red and 0 for everything else is going to be this color right here. It's a known color, and your computer should therefore be able to display that value to you. The idea here is that you'll be able to go from computer to device, a variety of other devices, and you'll be able to see the same color for your photograph on each. Now, of course, that's rarely the case, and I mean, part of the problem is that all of this stuff it's complicated, and color management is not an easy thing. Pretty much everybody, except people who really care about photography, ignore it, and that is what we are trying to solve today. So how you can make your photos look color accurate, not only for yourself, now that you will soon know and understand what this stuff means, but also for your friends who maybe you don't want to have to send this lecture to and make them sit 2 hours through a color management lecture and fiddle with settings on their particular computer. So most computers will be able to display this somewhat, kind of, sort of accurately, and that is what this is doing. So again, if you think of a photo, you can think of it as a large paint by numbers picture. So you have this very large photo, it's represented by pixels, and each pixel has a number associated with each. But until you know what each number is supposed to represent in terms of the color, you're not going to be able to paint that picture correctly. It's not going to have the correct color. Now you can imagine that for a paint by numbers picture, you could go really crazy and like swap blues and reds if you really didn't know. You'll generally get, like, if it's supposed to be red, you'll generally see it as being red. I'm not talking about that sort of craziness, but I'm talking about like how bright, or how saturated that red is, whether it's sort of a muddy, brownish, purplish red, or whether it's a more accurate, like red. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So sRGB, this is very, very common. This is what you should be using for anything that's destined for, say, Flickr, for your website, when you're emailing your friends, your family. This is what you should be using. Now, if you're going to be destining your photograph for print, you have to use a different color space. And so I just want to draw your attention to really quickly to this screen as I change the slide, because you will see the difference from the sRGB color space to the Adobe RGB color space. And you'll see that this one now extends a ways into the green section, whereas the sRGB color space definitely underrepresented the greens that we are capable of seeing. The Adobe RGB color space is able to represent a lot more green. And so it will look more accurate, especially for any landscape shots, anything where you have a predominance of green within the photograph. It will be displayed, you might say, more accurately by Adobe RGB. But this doesn't mean that if you are taking a photo that is outside or of something that's green, that you should switch your camera to Adobe RGB, because it's going to cause problems when you send it to your friends and they are only on an sRGB computer. So when they are viewing images and they're expecting those images to be sRGB, and most of our computers by default are expecting these photographs to be displayed in sRGB. And so it's the same thing with the same concept of painting by numbers. We still have the same number of values available to us. So we have 255 for red, 255 for green, 255 for blue. But what we're saying with this change in color space is that that value 255 for green represents a green that's way up there, much more saturated than what was 255, that same value in RGB. And that's why I'm saying if you take a photograph or you process it in Adobe RGB and it has a lot of greens in it and you're like, wow, this looks amazing, and you send it to your friends and it doesn't look that good, that's the reason, is that you're doing this conversion that may not be done very well and will be confusing to look at. Okay, so we're talking about having to do this sort of conversion, or being able to look at photographs with the same color across a multitude of devices. And that is exactly what color management tries to allow us to do. So what we can do is we can import an image, whether it be by a scanner, from an image file, from a digital camera. It comes in with these known values and it will have a profile associated with it. So whereas right here, so what we were talking about previously were color spaces, you can imagine that there is this other concept of profiles. Let's see, so to make this even more, to make this more concrete, you know that when you look at one computer and you go home to your computer and then maybe you go over to a friend's house and see a third computer still, that colors tend to just look ever so slightly different across each of these computers. So even if you're looking at the same web page or you're looking at the same image across all of these machines, they might look a little bit differently. And the reason for this is that the monitor is it's not able to display those colors very accurately. And that is what this concept of a profile is trying to overcome. So whereas we have a working color space right in the middle that defines exactly how saturated each of these colors should be, it defines exactly which color it should be, that is only half the picture. The other half is being able to apply these profiles to these devices, whether it be a scanner, whether it be a printer, whether it be a computer monitor, which tells the computer how to represent. It will say, okay, well, I know that I can represent colors from here to here to here, and this is how you do it. It tells the computer how to be able to replicate these colors that it wants to replicate. And so only by using a color management workflow that includes properly profiled devices, so by default, I'm sure most of your cameras will be properly profiled, but your laptop or your desktop computer monitor is what I'm referring to mostly here. If it is not profiled correctly, what the color space is telling the computer to print as this blue right here, your computer might completely mess up. And it might be a very ever so slightly different shade of blue, but just enough that if you were to print out that photo or if you were to send it to one of your friends, it would look very different. It would look very different to you, even if it's just ever so slightly shifted. So what we are attempting to do with these profiles is to know what the scanner or the printer or the monitor is able to reproduce in terms of its particular color. And so by having this profile, the computer then is able to apply this profile to the color space, and you will be able to see the image in the color you expect. Now, at this point, realize that we're talking about very subtle differences in color, but enough that it would be annoying or even discouraging as photographers at our particular level, where we're able to discern these differences. And this can be a big problem for us and frustrating if we're working on a photo and we work hard to get it just right and we print it out and the colors don't look the same. And that is precisely what this whole thing is trying to do. Okay, so just to give you an idea, it just so happens that Max, in addition to being able to show us or having that very fancy color meter application that's over here, it also does a pretty good job of displaying to us a variety of profiles that are available as well. So I just want to show you, for example, an sRGB profile. Oops. Let me show you in the one that you are familiar with. Nope, I think it was... Okay, so here, realize that this is a graph of the colors that are possible from, so it looks slightly different. Oh, okay, let's see. Nope. All right, well, this is going to be the closest one. So this is sort of a similar graph to what we were seeing in the slides. So we have, you imagine that there's the y-axis and the x-axis, and this is that line that goes around. And so when we're viewing sRGB, of all of the possible colors that are available to us, this is that sRGB color space. Now, just to give you an example, I can hold this for comparison, and then I can show a profile for my monitor. And so you can see now the difference from what my monitor is expecting to be able to show versus what RGB is wanting us to show. So if I have a photo that's tagged with an sRGB color space, then we would expect to see colors in this range of that outlined white triangle. But my monitor on this particular laptop is only capable of showing me colors in this range, from here to here to here to here. In fact, this is a problem of laptop monitors. They have a very limited, what's called gamut. And a gamut is basically how many colors it can show. Laptop monitors, portable device monitors are very, very bad at showing you a good or a wide gamut. And you usually have to go to expensive, not even that expensive, but decent desktop monitors to be able to represent a lot of the colors. And in fact, for those of you that may have been dealing with digital photography in the past, you may know that when there was this big push from the change from the large CRT monitors, remember the big ones that would take up your whole desk, to these thinner ones, all of the professionals were saying, no, I'm staying with my CRT monitor. The reason for that is that they got so good that they had a much wider gamut of colors that was much more accurate than LCDs. And now LCDs are just barely sort of catching up with, well, maybe not even that. Maybe in the past couple of years, they've been caught up with the CRT monitors of about 10 years ago. But for a while, there was this sort of awkward phase in LCD technology where it just was not as color accurate, or it just was not as possible to show us good saturated colors that a file wanted us to show. So there is something perilous about using only a laptop to do color work, and that is that it's not going to be exact. There's going to be a little bit of a shift in color, And I mean, that's fine. If that's all you have, that's certainly fine. It's not going to be a deal breaker, but it's something to be aware of, especially if you are interested in forming your own sort of photography business where color becomes, of the utmost importance. You may not be able to use your laptop unless it has a very, very good screen. Okay, so just to give you an example, I'll click on some of these other ones. So here is this is a printer, for example, and you'll see that it's kind of oddly shaped. It's much more bulbousy. The reason for that is that it has inks. And so this printer in particular might have maybe 5 inks or 6 inks or something like that. And it's capable of producing colors in sort of these outside regions. But when you combine them all together, it's still not very good. And so there's a lot of, I mean, you can look at a variety of profiles and see how they compare to the sRGB color space. But just realize that by my clicking on this, it's not actually affecting the color of anything. I'm just using this for informational purposes, just to show you the differences in these profiles versus some of these working spaces. So just to give you an idea, so NTSC, this is, if you're not familiar, NTSC is used for color encoding of televisions, and it's gone all the way back since the early 50s, I think. And it can encode a huge gamut of colors, and it's sort of funny because a lot of monitors, even today, just are incapable of showing all of the colors that this color space is supposed to be able to show us. And in fact, you can see underneath just how small this sRGB color space is compared to this much larger NTSC space. So when you're looking at a monitor, it might be rated in terms of percentage of NTSC or something like that. That's usually telling you how many colors of this NTSC space it is capable of producing. It's a marketing term, but they're using it as sort of a goal. They want to get to being able to display all of these colors that are possible. Okay, so let's just take a look at some other ones. Let's see, where's Adobe RGB? It's got to be up here. All right, so here you can see that well, it sort of made the other one disappear. So let me do this the opposite way. Hold that, and then I'll click on sRGB. And so you can see now just how much larger the Adobe RGB space is compared to sRGB. Okay, so what we are trying to do, just as a quick reminder, is we have these colors, and we're trying to represent them with numbers, literally, by values in a computer, and we need some way of doing that, and that is what this profile is able to do. It says, okay, for a number 255, you should have this value printed out, or you should have this value shown on your screen. And then even more abstract from that is this color space idea, where we are able to move a file that has a color space built into it from one computer to another, and we can say, okay, this value, this red should appear this way on this screen, and then the computer uses the profile to be able to show the value correctly on the computer screen. Now, as you can imagine, and as you saw, we have a variety of color spaces for us to work with. And sometimes we have to convert from one color space to another. And so this is a process that's called gamut mapping. And there's two major ways of being able to do this. So one is perceptual, and the other, and I always butcher how to pronounce this, is colorimetric. Oh, I think I did it. Nice. Okay. All right, so we have perceptual and colorimetric. And the way that each of these work is different. So imagine that we have an image, and it has a wide variety of colors from reds and greens. We want to change that image from an Adobe RGB color space, cram it into an sRGB color space. Now realize that what we're doing, this act of compressing as it looks like it's compressing, it's not actually changing the values in the image. I want that to be very, very clear. When we have an image and we have a green pixel, and it is red is 0, green is 255, and blue is 255, and we're converting how that color is going to appear from one space to another space, we're not changing the value, we're only changing the color space. And the color space, as you know, is going to be Oh man, I completely blanked on what I was talking about. So what was I talking about? Somebody help me out here. All right, so I started thinking about something else, and then I was like, wow, that's really interesting, and then I completely forgot what my mouth was doing, and so I lost it. Okay, yes?
I do have a question though, because you were saying converting from the sRGB to the Adobe RGB.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to, in my final project, I'll need to do that because I'm going to be having a printed photo book
Mm-hmm.
that will need to be Adobe RGB and then send you the images in sRGB. Which should I start with to convert to the other? Is there a difference in what you do? You see what I'm saying?
Oh, okay, yes. So that's a multifaceted question, and it's one that I think I can better answer especially in the next hour when we start talking about more of the workflow, like the how to do this stuff. So right now, this is sort of the theory behind all of this stuff, and then as we start talking about how this actually applies to Photoshop and to our workflow, then I hope that will become a little bit more clear. So let me address that maybe in the next hour when we start talking in more detail about this. Yes?
And maybe the workflow will help clarify my confusion as well.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is, what's the sense of converting? Aren't these profiles linked to the output of however you're looking at the
Mm-hmm.
image?
Yes, so the reason that we have to convert this sometimes is that we might have we might have an image that has one color space. So for example, we might have an image that is in the Adobe RGB color space, and we want to be able to post that image online for general consumption. And we shouldn't publish that photo in Adobe RGB color space. We should convert it to an sRGB color space, and then we will have, because that will allow the best opportunity for us to display color accurately from one computer to another.
Dan, my question is, the
Yep.
Adobe RGB has a larger color space.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're posting that online,
Mm-hmm.
and if the screen itself only supports the sRGB, wouldn't it just maximize the Adobe RGB space? So to speak?
Maximize the Adobe RGB space.
If the screen itself is limited to something close to the sRGB, say you posted an Adobe RGB photo online,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't the Adobe RGB just maximize the space that the screen allows? Because that space is smaller than the Adobe RGB?
Well, this is also a complex question because some web browsers, as we'll see in the second half, actually completely ignore color management, and the values that are associated with an image, and those values are supposed to represent some known color after you apply this color space and after you apply the profile. It's just completely disregarded by a very annoying browser, Internet Explorer in particular, and so it looks wrong. And so in order to combat this, you have to convert these images to what would be into the color space that a non-color managed browser would support by default. So just because it's displaying on a screen, it's most likely going to show an sRGB color space. And so an Adobe RGB file will appear incorrectly on a screen if it is not correctly color managed. And again, I have that's a question that I also will be answering in the second half when there's a very neat web page that shows the differences between color managed browsers, non-color managed browsers, and a lot of this other information. Okay, so back to gamut mapping. So we have a couple of different ways of converting an image's colors from one color space to another. So we could do perceptual, and the short of it is that if you're a photographer, perceptual is generally the way you're going to want to go, because you're not going to want to just get rid of extra images that exist within a particular image, because it will just clip the rest of the images. So it's as if you have lost details in the highlights, so to speak, but you've lost detail in the extremity of that particular color gamut. And So it's literally changing some values. And so just to give you an idea and just to demystify some of this information for you, I want to show you the color settings that are in Photoshop that are generally a good way to start out. So for the newer versions of Photoshop, you go to the, let's see, Edit menu. I have to, let's see, yeah, Edit menu and then Color Settings. When you click on that, it brings up this Color Settings window, and you see that there's a variety of options available here. So basing the settings off of just the typical North America General Purpose 2, that applies sort of a baseline level of settings. But what's important is this working spaces section. And we'll talk about why it's important to set this, so hopefully it'll become more clear in the next hour. But for RGB, which I'm sure most of you will actually be working with, I recommend setting that to sRGB. And so you'll notice that sRGB has this additional tag, IEC 61966-2.1. It's just a revision number, but sRGB and sRGB IEC 61966-2.1 are used interchangeably, so you can consider them the same thing. Okay, so I recommend that you leave sRGB as your working space. This means that new files that you create will be in this working space, and that it just makes it easier for you to deal with. And the reason for this is that if you are destining most of your photos for the web, as I do, then sRGB is the way to go. Now CMYK, this is just the default, I think. If you're doing professional level printing, which uses 4 colors, then you might have to change your working space to CMYK to be able to get the best color available. Gray and spot, that's just the default as well. So what's really important is that RGB, I think. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of printing on your own, then you might want to change this color space to Adobe RGB. Now, remember that this is dangerous because by default, you'll be creating documents and files in the Adobe RGB color space, and you shouldn't be sending those documents or those files to your friends because the colors will look weird. You have a better chance of having good color with an sRGB color space. Okay, now this is also really, really important. The color management policies. When we open a file that has a working space that is different than our working space above, so we currently in Photoshop have a working space of sRGB. That means most of the documents that we are working with or creating are in sRGB. But when we open a file that maybe has a different color space, like Adobe RGB, for example, these are the settings that apply to that. So what happens when I open that file? And by default, you must be preserving the embedded profiles. This ensures that when you open the file, it will be able to tell Photoshop, so to speak, though it's kind of the other way around, it tells Photoshop what the colors are, and Photoshop will be able to display those colors accurately. Most people get annoyed with all of the color management warnings when you open up a file and there's a color mismatch or something like that, and they tend to turn this off. But don't do that. If you disable color management in Photoshop, then you're just destroying all of this work that we're trying to establish today. You're just not going to have good, well-defined color from one file to the next. So don't turn this off. Preserve the embedded profiles. Now, profile mismatches, for some reason on this computer I don't have these on, but on the computer where I actually work, I do actually have it ask me when it's opening what to do with those profiles. And a profile mismatch is the one that I referenced before, where if I'm opening a file, this file has an embedded color profile of Adobe RGB, and Photoshop has a working color space of sRGB, then what am I supposed to do? And that is, I have it ask me what to do because usually I know a little bit about the file, a little bit of the context of the file and what I should be doing with that color profile. And most of the time, though, you will just want to preserve the embedded profiles, especially if you're just opening photos within Photoshop. Okay, so conversion, these are the defaults. So it uses the Adobe engine. This is what happens when you're converting from one color space to the next. I do recommend perceptual, the intent being perceptual. That's that gamut mapping change because it maintains the gradients within the colors rather than just chopping off extraneous colors that you might have when mapping from an Adobe RGB color space to an sRGB color space. Use dither. That's just a way of it trying to simulate the colors that existed in other color profiles. So that's the color settings within Photoshop. And so I think piece by piece, we're starting to put some of this together. But for us to really understand it, we'll have to look at some examples. And in order for us to do that, we have to take a 5-minute break.